Hello everyone, today we talk about Scots-Irish warfare between the 2nd and the 6th century AD, circa. I already made a video about the Gaelic warrior. Today, not to make too much confusion between the Gaels, the Scotty and Scots, etc. We will refer more simply to Ireland and the Irish specifically. But the term Scotty was essentially the one to which all the old Gaels were originally called, so also the ones that, as you know, settled, as we will see now, as well, in Western Britain, and given birth also to the famous kingdom of Dal Riata, and gradually mixing with the Picts to give birth to essentially what we consider as medieval Scotland. Because in fact of the Scots, the Scotty that came eventually to identify just this northern Gaels, the Picts too, are considered basically an insular Celtic people, very similar to the Britons, practically indistinguishable from them. We made a couple of videos about the Picts. Mostly one was the Battle of Montgrampius. The other was probably Pictish warfare in slightly later a time span than the one we're looking at, mostly during the early Middle Ages. So if you're interested, I also have a playlist on Celtic warfare and Celtic history that you can look at. But today we talk again just mostly about the Irish, that in this sense are actually even better documented than the early Picts. Frankly, even though the Picts also launched actually attacks on the same Ireland at some point. Think about Domhnall Breck that was defeated at the Battle of Moira by the High King of Ireland, and this around the 30s of the 7th century, with which the last dynastic link between the Dalriadan Scots and Ireland is severed, effectively. But the Scottish migrations from Northern Ireland into Britain, mostly in the north, but also in the west, as you know, had been occurring up to en masse up to the 6th century, right? So there was always an important link, as you know, between the two areas. Also in Iberno Norse times, if you look at the West Highlands in Scotland, they always maintained this kind of distinct, in part, in fact, Norse, but also in part Hibernic character, Gaelic character, kind of more pronounced in the same Scotland that in great part, especially in the lowlands, had been Normanized at that point, and so on. But again, we will look at these things better at some other point. Today we look fundamentally at ancient history, late antiquity as well, and the interaction of the Irish with the Roman Empire is also very interesting. I already made a video about why didn't the Romans conquer Ireland. In part we will touch the same topic today. That was more of a methodological note, but it can help if you're interested in the question. So as we just said, the Scoti, that by the way are called like this in Latin, seemingly deriving etymologically from raiding. Right, this would be the nickname matured by the Irish in Roman eyes, even though, of course, the political fragmentation of Ireland, as you know, was chronic, would always factually remain. Right, it was a high king of all Ireland who was factually recognized because every people has a need to have some sort of central power. At the Irish kings were considered as semi-divine, as in most Indo-European peoples. The origins are always in this interbreeding between the race of the gods and the race of the mortals, and so all the various legions, the Ulster cycle, and so on. Coquelin will also mention unavoidably today a lot, or refer a bit to this idea that there was probably a sacred nature of the kings recognized, and this came, of course, also with an important burden. The actual reality, however, as you know, was the one of almost continuous warfare between the various Irish petty kingdoms that were fiercely competing with each other. Um, these were fundamentally a Celtic people, as you know, so the Irish are part of the Indo-European wave from the continent that, especially in the British Islands, arrived, as you know, different waves that were sometimes also very distant from one another. Right, in Britain you find some, namely Celtic peoples, let's say of the Midlands, etc., that had settled for a very long time before, like in the 6th, 7th century BC something, but nobody really knows even with certainty because it's very difficult to trace archaeological differences. But let's say the Belgians are arriving in the last centuries before Christ, like, who were these guys, right? They knew them, they felt the affinity. And one of the consequences that is a bit typical of Northern Europe is that this is to be found, for example, in the preeminence of giants, and this kind of darker view of the Twilight of the Gods in the Germano-Norse mythology. We made a video about that. In the case of the Irish, it's kind of even more peripheral, right? Ireland was a rather poor and primitive land, and this meant that, first of all, those who settled there as conquerors were, in a sense, the least successful of all, right? The most successful Indo-Europeans, the strongest ones, and that won this greater ideology that is also mirrored in their mythologies, were in the Dorians in Greece, even the Italics in Italy and so on. This was an area that not only was kind of more peripheral, but in this sense offered less possibility, as we've just seen, of centralization. And so the same Celtic Indo-European rule was more tenuous, and in Irish mythology this is very well mirrored, and we will talk extensively about this, by the extremely intense chthonic, feminine, telluric, Dionysian element in the same mythology, in the same warfare, however, which is highlighted by, for example, the presence of women, right, of druidesses, of this kind of properly military class of noble women that would have mirrored essentially the ancient civilization of the Bronze Age, dominated by the Great Mother. That, in fact, the mythology compromises, the Irish mythology, that is Indo-European, however, compromises clearly with, to essentially mirror the negotiation that had occurred between the Celtic, incredibly, as you know, as all Indo-European peoples, radically patriarchal, virile, Uranic, Apollonian vision of imperialistic vision of the world, with this other one that could not really be extirpated. And again, this is present also in animal symbolism. I also, I think, hinted at this in that video I made on the Celtic and totemic animals, though totemic is not necessarily, say, maybe for the civilization of the matter it is, right? But for Indo-Europeans it was not, because Indo-Europeans just believed to be derived from the races of God, from the race of God, and so any degeneration of it was kind of creating the animal monsters like the Minotaurs. There are many of these clashes in the Irish mythology as well, archetypically speaking. In any case, aside from their pretty wild, violent lifestyle in their island, the Irish, during maybe the rare intervals of peace, or even when it was simply more profitable, raided extensively overseas in their hide boats. And this is one of the most fascinating and characteristic aspect of Irish warfare. And the iconic, kind of even nationally symbolic boat used by the Irish since that time is the curragh, through which the same Romans came to know more directly, in a sense, from a military point of view, the Scots. Right, also the Picts were up to naval expeditions, but they bordered the Roman Empire with Hadrian's Wall and the Roman expeditions in the same Scotland. I mean, you understand, in Caledonia, Pict land. So that the broader Roman perspective on these peoples of the Irish from a military point of view was, in fact, them as sea raiders, the Scotti, which what actually seems to have meant, as we just said. Sea power was really vital among the Celts at this point, right? The Germanic presence was yet to be felt in a consistent way. As you know, in Hiberno-Norse times, basically the Vikings were even dramatically more advanced than the same Irish. It just tells you what the Irish were really about. They took over basically the entire coast, so also that the modern main Irish cities, fundamentally, even though there were previous settlements, naturally derived, as you know, starting from Dublin, from Norse entrenched camps for Viking raiding. So the curraghs were made from hide, stretched over a frame. Caesar, that had been knowing Celts, as you know, from a military point of view, implies some frames of wicker work, right? While the later monks of Iona that were pretty much in the eye of the hurricane in terms of Celtic piracy, also ordered for themselves wood for a long ship, probably for the frame and mast. And curraghs were naturally of different dimensions. It seems that they could be up to 15 meters long. It's not huge, but this reflects in practice with the, in fact, the northern piracy and generally speaking towards late antiquity, the broader naval warfare was about, right? A bit like in the same Roman legions, right? The early imperial massive armies were segmented into smaller units that could be more autonomous. The same can be observed by massive vessels of the early era and the smaller ones of the later empire. And I also made a video about, you know, the difference in sails properly that this naval engineering change, let's say, brought with it. And there is some evidence to say the curraghs are also kind of, you know, they remain in Irish culture throughout the centuries to be documented. But from the times we have, for example, money coins from Electus, that was an usurper ruling over Britain and Gaul, right? So they're Roman coins showing high riding vessels with up to 7 oars, right? Each side and a single sail. While there is if I'm not wrong, 1st century AD or BC, actually, I think, Irish broider model boat in gold, I think, showing 9 rowing benches and oar holes through the hull, right? A steering oar set on the port side, and a mast and yard. And the reason these boats were fairly modest in size, which again, let's not exaggerate, but surely reflects the political fragmentation of the same Ireland, meaning that there wasn't like a centralized capacity to maintain, you know, consistent number of larger vessels, because simply there would have not been the possibility simply of sustaining it or supporting that cost for any local power, and it was actually much more profitable to strike also at various places at once, right? Given that these peoples lacked properly even the possibility of occupying permanently large areas, conquering them from the Romans, etc. So it was just about raiding, right? And for that you need, you know, lots of boats that can give you an important flexibility. In fact, the main problem for the Romans was catching these ships. Was not really an existential threat posed to their rule. Even just speaking of the individual peoples that, as we've seen, would have had to coalesce in order to make significant damage. It was still, however, about raiding and not occupying. But if one considers the entirety of some expeditions, well, pretty sizable amount of boats could be put in a joint of fort, let's say, coordinated effort, and also transporting, in theory, thousands of warriors at huge distances by sea and fighting, in theory, major campaigns, right? Curragh is that also probably inspired the later tales of saints sailing on millstones, as worn-out rounded millstone makes ideal ballast for such a craft, but also posing a broader collective strategic threat for the Romans to take it in consideration. In the 4th century, Theodosius pursued a Pictish fleet, for example, up to Thule, which, according to Ptolemy, Pythias and the Irish monks would be in Iceland, right? And in fact, hordes of Roman coins from the period of, let's say, 270 to 305 AD have been found in Iceland, and it might have been the consequence of Celtic pirates retreating, right, being chased by the Roman navy up there, where they buried their treasure to come back, maybe at some point. And to such raids also, but the Spirit of Ireland is connected in its redemption, let's say, as in one of these successful pirate raids, St. Patrick was enslaved and brought to the island. There was a less successful raid, ending with the High King of Ireland, Niall of the Nine Hostages, drowning in the channel, and it's been speculated that, you know, the guy may have run into a Roman squadron who sunk him. So the broader expansional capacities of Irish piracy brought, however, to permanent settlement in particular areas of Britain, Pembrokeshire, Western Wales, and later, more importantly, in Galloway, southwestern Scotland. In fact, the latter spreading out to conquer, actually, in the British mainland, and amalgamating with the Picts under the rule of Kenneth MacAlpin in about the mid-9th century, let's say, thus founding, as we were saying before, the Kingdom of Scotland. So as we were just saying, the main problem posed the Roman defenders of Britain by the Irish raiders was catching them, right? If you look at fortresses like those of the Saxon shore, well, they were built in the same way and period at Chernerbourne and Cardiff, and this may have served as basis for naval squadrons, well suited for it for sure. And broadly speaking, the best hope the Irish raiders had once ashore would be either to do their work swiftly and escape again to sea, right? A bit like in the early Viking era, when, you know, fundamentally it was not a broadly coordinated effort politically or strategically. It was just, you know, bands fundamentally carrying out these operations. We'll see the Fiannas in a while, that also participated actually to the Roman army themselves very often, and or, you know, either voluntarily or were captured and enlisted in kind of in the auxilium, as we will see now. Or there could be, say, a greater coordination with other peoples, right, among the same, you know, Irish through the mean of alliance, but also the Picts and even continental peoples, to overwhelm the Roman defenses, essentially with numbers, or at least attacking in multiple places at once, right? So that they could at some point simply pin the Roman forces into a specific fortress and having enough time to raid, loot, plunder, and coming back home loaded in riches, if the Romans eventually wouldn't actually run after them and recover the prey. There is a major raid in the 60s of the 4th century that is basically the worst that Roman Britain ever suffered, which witnesses the incredible coordination capacities of these peoples at a point. Hordes have been found in Britain, with some controversy at a time on the actual dating of these hordes, that everybody say, oh, it's associated to the migration era, right? People's on the move, raids. somebody leaving their own community, maybe burying their own riches to come back, picking them up afterwards and never doing it, etc. This is not entirely clear, but the general mood and change that was occurring at that time is somewhat of instability, right? Of an important crisis that actually would never occur until fundamentally the Romans abandoned Britain, and pretty interesting internal changes occurred within the same Britain, regardless of external attacks, etc. In fact, the Anglo-Saxon swarming in was actually more like a consequence of this collapse than anything. As you know, the Romano-Britons hired these troops. They were not the first Germans setting foot in Britain, because it was the same Romans that had previously settled, as we'll see now, other continental ones. However, definitely the Celtic fringe enjoyed, raiding, as so much that we can argue it was their primary occupation. And as we were saying before, they would never actually bring to a conquest, to a territorial acquisition. They didn't have the means to afford that. They didn't have the means to carry that out, to maintain the eventual lands, and so loot was the first and only option, actually. There was pretty intense negotiation going on with, especially the northern, with the Picts, right, in the 4th century. But in the 60s, the Scotti and the Picti together, breaking the truce that had been, in fact, obtained in 343 with the same emperor, ravaged essentially the frontier, right, of Hadrian's Wall area. And over the next 7 years, together with the Saxons and also this other relatively mysterious people we will talk about now, the Atecotti, harassed the Roman Britons continuously. And the raidings of the 60s were not like the previous ones, right? Nor led by random war bands, uncoordinated with each other. But it seems that they were the plan and coordination of very capable leaders who had carefully carried them out. The Irish, the Picts, the Hebrides Islands, and even the populations of partly, essentially the Germans of Gaul and Germany itself participated, right? Each essentially from their own direction. Ships were built, war bands were trained and assembled, and the same Roman administration was probably corrupted. The front line militia units, also some agents, right, secret service like the Arcani, for example, were bribed or intimidated at some point, or they participated to the raids, which often happened, like as a broader collapse of public authority. And then in 368, this is the date, all this coalition launched a massive attack against a bit this western sector of the Roman Empire. Picts, Scots, Saxons attacked in multiple raids, actually, but still coordinated with one another. The Picts attacked mostly from the wall, the Irish from the sea. The Alemanni broke into Gaul. Other tribes attacked Central Europe. And the Roman defenders of Britain suffered important reverses. For example, Fulufaudes, that was the Dux Britonum, right, was ambushed with his army as it was rushing from Eburacum. Nectarides, the Comes Littoris Saxonici, was defeated at sea by the Germanic forces. This caused like a paralysis of the Roman forces on the island, and essentially allowed further raids to continue that year. So this was actually the most devastating thing that ever happened to Roman Britain in perspective, and it was not a single conquest of land here, and probably also the Romans suffered a contained number of losses. However, the moral political effect on Britain was relevant because basically the Romano-Britons didn't trust very much the imperial administration and armed forces anymore for being able to prevent this raids and defending the population from them. And by the time Emperor Theodosius arrived with reinforcement, the province had been severely looted. Right, many of the enemy warriors had eventually come back home, and so there was nothing to counter anymore. And hostilities went on for an entire year before peace was restored. Right, the Romans didn't just sit there; they actually launched a reprisal attacks on the Orkneys and Shetlands. So it's very interesting to see how even kind of a older, let's say, Viking era by a certain degree, and with the same geography of it, was occurring. And this was a time in which the Romans also attempted to create again a new province in Scotland, right north of the walls of Antonines and Hadrians, which still reflects the Roman important possibilities and capacities to wage war to this extent. But as we were also talking about in the other video, why the Romans didn't conquer permanently was Ireland, but saying could go for Scotland, is that what was the broader purpose in the world scale politics and strategy of Rome to actually invest resources in these lands that were also not particularly remunerative, and the same Britain was kind of a peripheral secondary province. At the end of the day, it would even be abandoned at the beginning of the following century willingly, right, with still some local administration maintaining itself autonomously, but say still with not a direct Roman involvement anymore, right, of the field army, which is also interesting because we tend to think of the Roman Empire again in 19th century nationalistic Victorian kind of geographic terms. What was outside or inside the empire? What was the border of the empire? What was under the Romans or outside the Rome controlled practically anything, right? Walls were not actual borders as we intend them. Rome still exercised an important political and moral influence on whoever lived in Europe fundamentally. So the reduction of Roman force was gradual and say connected to mechanisms that didn't have really to do with the control or of this or that specific land, especially the least productive ones. But it's very interesting to see how the peoples who inhabited these frontiers were able to spot the Roman weaknesses in this sense and exploiting them successfully. And as I was saying before, as a consequence of the 368 raid was the actually first Germanic settlement in Britain, as the Romans brought a captured unit of Alamanni to guard Britain as federati, right? And the Germans had already fought in Britain for the Romans at the Battle of Mont Graupius. Basically, the Batavian infantry defeated alone the entire Pictish army, and about the differences in kind of military quality between the Celtic and the Germanic world would be a lot to say, because here we're not making mythomaniacal content, but we're actually assessing military capacities per se. Well, it's quite significant that these peoples had kind of always interacted with each other, already knew what the situation was. And in fact, speaking of the Attecotti that are this bit mysterious population participating in these raids, there's a bit of historiographical mystery. Some think that they may have been Irish or Celts in general. Others that they were Scandinavian, right? And they were described as unusually savage. Ammianus records the Attacoats, warlike band, and the Scots wandering up and down, committing great depredations. So de facto associating the Attacoats to the same Scotti, while the Notitia Dignitatum registers 4 units of the Auxilia Palatina. So these were fundamentally the picked mercenaries of the Roman army, with the name of Attacoti, etc. That would be, again, this normal foreign units the Romans hired and that had made a living in the Roman army. Very often also discharge coming back home, and we have plenty of this kind of also pride of these people in their burials. They wanted to be recognized, to be remembered as Roman veterans, despite being proud, kind of ethnic, freemen of their people. And there is an interesting debate historiographically about the etymology of Attacoti, that, as we've seen, seem to be particularly savage. They dwell around this, the northern seas, in this western sector. So they were, yes, either Celtic or Germanic, or maybe they were a mix of both. In the 18th century, an Irish historian came up with a theory that would connect the Attacoti to the old Irish term Aitech Tuata. That is a generic designation for certain Irish population groups, usually translated as either essentially as tributary peoples, right? Rent-paying tribes, vassal communities. And this aspect is quite interesting because it would fit, albeit some philologists, I think the most updated historiography rejects this explanation on a very etymological base. They say fundamentally that what Ammianus says sounds too altered from the old Irish alleged equivalent. I don't think so personally. To me, it seems like a pretty convincing concept, and it would stem from the actual presence of Irish tributary to the Roman Empire. Right? That the same Irish would indicate as, look, those guys are the ones who cooperated with the Romans, who sent troops to them, who are this Attacoti in the Roman army. So present, and this Irish word seems pretty close to that. There is more, as in the same Ulster cycle, there is the clash between the hero, the semi-divine Cuchulainn, and Calatin, that was an Irish clan, right? The etymology of which is reminiscent of Palatina, the same one of the Auxilia, in which we find the Attacoti as well. And what is even more interesting is that in the story, this clan Calatin consisted of essentially the head of the clan, the father, who is depicted as a powerful wizard, right? And his 27 sons. That would form basically a huge monster altogether, having 28 heads, 56 arms, 56 legs, and throwing a simultaneous volley of 28 heavy barbed spears. Does it remember anything to you? Why not? This was probably a very close-knit and very highly trained clan that may have been actually schooled in warfare by the Roman army. You notice here this also kind of interesting numeric multiplication. Of course, it has to do with the number of the clansmen and the normal amount of limbs and head of a human being. But there is also this thing of, so first of all acting at unison, but throwing a volley of 28 heavy barbed spears, like the plumbate or mazio barbuli of the Roman army. That naturally Cuchulainn fences off with his shield and he slays the enemy clansmen. And that may represent also a bit this hostility, right, of the Free Irish against maybe Roman interference and the cooperation, collaboration of other Irish instead with the Romans. And I would like to think that this, of course, is what historiographers have described already as a body of drilled warriors that may speak also of other traces of Roman interference in Ireland, famously enough, as of course Roman artifacts have extensively been found, but specifically of an Irish military participation in the Roman foreign troops on a regular basis, and that the Atecotti would be what the Romans would call, in kind of this Latinized version of the old Irish term, those pretty unruly, in theory, Roman tributaries of Ireland that, however, were very difficultly persuaded to stay boat, right? And this was a bit the main problem of these peoples, like a bit like the Germans. They were more politically compact at this point, but previously all these scattered tribes that were very, very, very difficult to control individually, right? And that would have intermittent relations with Rome in a way or another. And this was daily administration for the Romans. And if you step a bit back in time, there is also the very famous episode narrated by Tacitus about his father-in-law, Agricola, who also launched his invasion of Caledonia, defeating the locals in battle and testing fundamentally whether the land could be brought under direct Roman domination. And Agricola was talking about Ireland as well, that to conquer he considered 2 Roman legions and attached auxiliaries to be enough. This Roman invasion of Ibernia was not carried out eventually. It's possible, naturally, that Romans sent some detachments also to interfere with this various Irish leaders. The 2nd century Roman poet Juvenal, who may have served in Britain himself under the same Agricola, wrote that, quote, arms had been taken beyond the shores of Ireland. But the broader point was not like a Roman particular interest or even specific hostility towards the Irish, rather probably a broader political and strategic interest in bringing Caledonia under, right? Because if the Romans had occupied Ireland at that point, Caledonia would have been factually isolated in a meaningful way from, the surrounding markets, and would have more easily brought under. But even there, what was the actual need and priority for the Romans to bring these lands under control? Well, remember that there is hardly any more practical people than the Romans, right? So if they did something or didn't do something, there was always kind of a, pretty good assessment. Connected, however, to Agricola, there is what also, in fact, Tacitus talks about, the episode of an Irish leader, one of the many, say, kinglets, as we'll see, maybe he was something more, but this is just speculative. Interestingly enough, fled Ireland, taking refuge in Roman Britain under Agricola, and Agricola would send him back to recover what was his. And there is an Irish tale, the Tuathal Techtmar, that talks exactly about this, that the High King of Ireland, that philology would date in this case to exactly the same years in which Agricola protected this Irish leader, and the same Juvenal talks of Roman troops actually setting foot in Ireland and more. Also because the hero of the story actually manages to get back in power. And so it's possible that the shared Irish-Roman memory is about the same event and this cooperation. So this is kind of obvious and quite likely even to have happened, right? Speaking of Gaelic warfare, I think we gave an important depiction of the same in that video about the Gaelic warrior that mostly revolved around kind of the elite type of guy that probably was not dramatically different also from the average warrior because of the, in fact, scarce political social stratification of Ireland. Right. The point I made other videos about Irish warfare in medieval times, especially in the high medieval times between the 12th to 13th century. And as you know, these are very conservative areas in the history of warfare. The Celtic fringe went on. We also made a video about West Highlanders and late Middle Ages. You know, these were people who would go, you know, armed the same panoply of medieval times, like up to the 17th century, and with practices that, as we will see now, are pretty much the same, including the initiatory ones about, you know, sending boys out until, and you know, not making them coming back until they had killed another person. So, you know, this gentle, civilized practices that we all appreciate but that were functional to their own, in fact, political military system. And generally speaking, there is this idea that Ireland was not highly militarized because we see even just technologically that there wasn't a dramatic development of sorts. So some say that without any significant external threat, as Ireland, as we've seen, was practically never invaded, it was just the Celts arriving at waves and mixing again with also the pre-existing population in very gradual fashion. But there would have been a little pressure to improve military technology. The point is that whenever, you know, even the Irish received an important military pressure, see the Vikings, the Anglo-Normans, etc. Yes, there were some improvements, some osmosis, some hybrid, but practically the local warfare remained the same. And this, of course, has to do with politics and society, but more specifically with the fact that, and this is the sad truth, that Ireland was dramatically underdeveloped, right? And it was dramatically poor, with very scarce population concentration of a few, you know, centers, few communications, was covered in forests. So it's just normal, just for the broader northern fringe of Europe to be in that situation, not being able to afford to improve its military instrument. Right, and speaking of people fixate on technology in general. You know, technology, etc. No, right? The Irish were pretty good at what they did, you know, at their own type of warfare. Of course, they were dramatically disadvantaged. Again, the Vikings were the Vikings, right? So we're not even definitely talking about the single most advanced peoples out there, but they were light years ahead compared to the Irish. If we're not talking about the Anglo-Normans. So, of course, in reality, there is always, we're talking about medieval times, there's not a huge difference. But for those times, in relative terms, it was a big one, right? And Irish warfare reflects this kind of also scarce traces and documentation that we have in the first place. And this has also, unfortunately, generated some too much of a negative or kind of pessimistic or deterministic, relativistic idea of what Irish warfare really was. Right, we've seen that, especially at this point in the still ancient times, Scot-Irish armies at home consisted of noble chariotry, similar to that of the Britons, but probably even more loaded with that kind of heroic ethos. Right, so the less developed, the more you find this kind of thing. Chariot warfare basically existed just in the Celtic fringe and in North Africa at that point. Right? The rest of Europe and the Mediterranean had abandoned it in combat. Maybe just the Indians used it for other reasons. But there were also differences in type of chariot warfare. I made a video last autumn about Celtic Iron Age war chariot that encompasses, and also draws, in fact, also from the Ulster cycles, very spot on information, because, you know, if you read the stories of Cuchulainn and the Red Branch, there is a pretty graphic description of Gaelic warfare. And naturally, as we will see now, this entailed essentially also support by loose infantry formations, mostly armed with poor weapons, right? Javelins, short swords / daggers. There were some distinctive features, for example, the large-bladed Irish spear or something that were normally in heroic warfare accompanying the hero, because right, the single guy, even though the especially Irish mythology is full of this radically superomistic kind of idea. We'll read it now with Coquelin, had in practice never been without a form of support, because the rest of the community fought alongside these heroes that they consider still as demigods. Right? This is a traumatically and brutally non-modern and secular reality. Right? These people are living still in a world where they think, yeah, that this, if you have this lord on chariot, this is maybe a demigod. It belongs to the higher race of the heavens, and is here with superpowers. And the high king of Ireland also had many prerogatives that the rest of the people could not have, because he was sacred and so on. So we will perhaps show it this better now. But there are some negative stereotypes, such as the Irish didn't have cavalry. Right, this is also something that triggers me when it's said about the Britons, that not just they had it, Caesar records it pretty well, and also in kind of interesting terms, but kind of obviously there was cavalry. It's not that Ireland even was a particularly good terrain for chariotry in the first place, but of course, it was used as cavalry was used, and the art of war was gradually transitioning to the development of cavalry, right, and the gradual decline of chariotry. Of course, again, Ireland was that primitive, and so this change happened more slowly. But cavalry did exist, right? The Irish fashion was, wearing only a pad on horseback, very often also riding bareback. And there was surely in later times, also when the stirrup arrived in Europe in early medieval times, probably spread there. There was a high saddle and stirrups. The Celts, the Gauls used horn saddles. There were, again, cavalry in this sense in the ancient world was a bit ridiculous in terms of grip on the ground. They had things like hippo sandals, the horn saddle, but it's better than nothing, right? Also, people say, the sling was used for hunting and may occasionally have been used in war. What the hell of concept is this, right? If you have a sling, you use it by default, like it's a weapon that you just have, and you can use against animals and against human beings. Also because they didn't really distinguish much between them, especially in a culture that, of course, was deeply soaked in this idea of kind of properly racial superiority stemming from the race of gods of the conquerors, and the others being kind of half people or something ever lesser. So it was something viciously brutal, right? The kings of Ireland normally lived with some areas of their abodes, dedicated specifically to the collection of severed hands of fallen enemies, and with all the the ritual practices and ideas of power transmigrating from them to their power. So we are at these levels of I don't know even how to define that, but you understand the point. And it's really beautiful to read about them too, because the style of warfare reflects that mindset. We don't know much about the Irish methods used overseas, but presumably, the Irish armies were the same at home and overseas. Maybe even a bit more of cavalry was necessary for the raids to speed up certain maneuvers locally, a bit like the Vikings that even adapted part of their ships later on for carrying horses. And in fact, it's possible to transport cattle and ponies in a correg. Right, you tie their legs, and the chariots can be dismantled. So it's quite easy actually to mount up a significant expedition with a consistent amount of cavalry force. But what really the Irish mindset was rooted in was this, again, almost, in fact, super mystic, heroic, fanatic obsession, mania, that was functional to their own warfare. Again, it was essentially what basically all other peoples had been through at some point. Consider that Coquelin was considered to be Lug, so the Celtic god present also in Gaul, but kind of maybe the only real deity witnessed in common between the Gaels and the continental Celts. Considered again that was this very important chthonic substratum of local Irish deities. There was also a lot of deification, a lot of mounds where these heroes were, these chieftains were buried, would become shrines that also in the later kind of Celtic way to Christianity would overlap with one of local saints, right? So I made a video about, I don't remember how it's titled, but about the kind of Celtic spiritualities at the roots of Christian Europe, that talks about Patrick, about Brendan, about the relation, in fact, of this Christians at some point, bishops and missionaries, with properly the Celtic, with the local Gaelic warlike culture, military culture, the idea that in order to be seen as a ruler, to have any power of sort, you had to defeat these heroes in battle, right? And so there were clashes. Remember, even Coquelin says, there was that with the clan Calatin, that kind of wizard, right? Which might have been said every one of these people in the clan was poisonous, and so it may be, who knows, maybe it was even a Christian leader, somebody who had showed sympathy towards still the Roman models at some point, that had brought in that idea, and that the Ulster cycle identifies like maybe a bit like the chthonic one in their own perspective, because as you know, it was the same thing with people that complain about the Romans called the others barbarians, what a terrible thing. Well, the entire Indo-European tradition, identity, and ideology is based on the idea that whoever is weaker than you is a barbarian. So the Celts, the Germans, everybody believed that the others were barbarians, treating them like animals, and didn't know the difference between, a slave and a human being, right? So it was just a matter of who was superior and who was inferior, really. But this was proven in that kind of idea of immaterial transcendence of that the warrior would achieve in combat. It's a bit like here Lug, Coquelin would be Lug himself, even though he was his father, and he was generated with a local, with a woman, with a fallen woman, because this is also the point of Indo-European ideologies, that mythologies, that the gods are the actual race of humans, that we are as mortals just people who do not know how to become superior and transfigurate anymore, because we have blended and kind of also physically deteriorated. And that's the reason why also there is a tragic destiny of all these heroes. As you know, Coquelin is just a boy, and eventually he dies young, and it's a bit like, again, the dimming of the twilight of the gods, and this dimming of the religious awareness within a human soul. But Lug himself has several magical possessions that he displays in warfare. For example, he wields an unstoppable fiery spear, like the Gungnir of Odin, like the sling stone, right? Which people say, maybe the sling was used also in warfare sometimes. What do you think the slings were out there for? What do you think, like, what kind of sick twisted idea of technology do you have in your mind? This is what we have denaturated our world from any form of intelligence, to the point it's all materialism, and not even making 2 + 2 like even a child would understand this. Also, Lug owns a hound named Phylinus. Coquelin basically means hound of Colan, because he had slaughtered this dog, this terrible hound that had attacked him while he was coming in a play, and these hounds were famously connected also to the huge Irish Wolf-Hound, which reflects this mostly, in fact, lordly lifestyle. You know, these hounds were used in battle, as a matter of fact, as guards, as you know, as in actual combat, but also because those who used them had fit them for hunting in general, right? Animals and men as a general game, right? And were selected breeds exactly for this reason. Lug is said to have invented fitshell, bull games, horse racing. So people say, oh, you know, the Irish didn't have cavalry. You know, they basically worshipped demigods whose fathers had invented horse racing. Could this be like, you know, but doesn't mean that it's mounted war, blah 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 blah. But do you have an idea of how, you know, like, why would there have been, like, you know, how it is in Britain? They used mounted warfare, and you know, you step in Ireland and say, no, here's forbidden, sorry, we don't use them, now you can't, right? How the hell do you reason? Of course they used extensively cavalry for their own possibilities. Then of course, if their possibilities were pretty meager, like in the case of Ireland, well, of course, yes, they had probably not many horses. Mounted warfare was, especially in terms of horse riding, was not maybe this great thing, was asphyctic. There's no doubt, right? This is pretty obvious. When the Anglo-Normans and their magnificent equestrian military culture arrived in Ireland, surely it was nothing even remotely comparable to it. But still, of course, mounted warfare existed. By the way, the hound is also kind of an idea of the Wolf-Hound as family. So there is all this connection, including the crow, that figures prominently also in the brotherhoods of warriors. We mostly know about that actually from Pictish iconography, but if you there's that episode of Cuchulainn fighting the one-eyed hag in Pictland, as a matter of fact, whose name is Anchen, the bird-headed mother of three of Aoife's champions. And so here is the Anchen Duck, that is a bird feather mask or cloak worn in probably totemistic ceremonies, in a sense, because these were chthonic, in fact, symbols, but they had to do with, of course, the connection with the afterlife is still the divine. So it's likely that raven-masked priests or priestesses, as a matter of fact, as we will see now in a while, because there were, for example, the Morrigan is connected to that as well. She manifests like that. As part of that chthonic background, we'll talk about female warfare in Ireland. But they cited also the, I don't know, deer heads, carved deer heads used as ritual masks. Think about Lugots. Also probably the dog or wolf mask figures, a bit like more in the Germanic kind of Longbird tradition, or the bear, a bit in the Norse one, the Frankish one. So depending a bit on what the broader symbolism really was, and it may have been part of a broader ceremonial, but surely they were used in battle as well, right? I never understand when people say, no, this was just for ceremonies. Well, their entire mythology revolved around the idea of turning into a beast, right, in combat. Especially some warriors had to test themselves and to demonstrate to be full devotees of the divinity that was incidentally also the same warlord, their warband leader. And so I made lots of videos about the Comitatus, but today we will talk about the Fiannas as well for the Irish. And in that video about the Gaelic warrior, I talked extensively about the Fiannas and this, you know, war bands of devotees who literally were like you didn't exist as a human being anymore. You were just an extension of the divinity. The moment you entered in, and you just had to be the divinity. That is to say, to essentially, in theory, to kill yourself in combat just for proving that, for making your spirit elevating and destroying your negative chthonic self, and actually transforming the same into the angel that would have brought you to heaven with the glory of the gods. This was a bit the idea. But it's true, again, as we were saying before, that the Celtic Germanic world was a bit darker relatively to this, and not because, in fact, of some ancestral homeland of the hardcore Indo-European beliefs, but quite the contrary. Like this kind of where these beliefs had been a bit more challenged by the local chthonic prevalence that even in this wild north, less Indo-Europeans had pushed into, so that demographically they had been a bit more in minority, in spite of their dramatic capacity of subjugation, just because of their militaristic cult. Now, there is a passage from Athenaeus quoting one old Celtic hero as saying, quote, "My pointed spear, my sharp sword, my glittering shield are my wealth and riches. With them I plough, with them I sow, and with them I make my wine. Whoever dared not resist my pointed spear, my sharp sword, and my glittering shield prostrates himself before and adores me as his lord and king." This was, even though in a, kind of already modernized and secularized version at the time, the actual mindset of the Indo-European hero / warrior. That is to say, through his own mere deterrence, actually. This was living on, for example, in the Alexandrine, eventually Roman tradition of simply entering other lands and everybody simply accepting your rule as simply the manifestation of the imperium, as a matter of fact, which meant, of course, that these were kind of feudal cultures, right? Even though from the Enlightenment we decided that all history had to be about an egalitarian ethos from the Greeks, the Romans, the Celts, the Germans. They were all essentially feudal oligarchic societies, right? And deeply soaked in this idea of properly imperialistic supremacy based on spiritual and cultural superiority, manifested properly military power. So this was a bit, I think, the same idea inspiring in the Ulster cycle when Emer, that would become Cuchulainn's wife, when she describes herself to Cuchulainn as Tara among women fairest of maidens, a paragon of chastity, while Cuchulainn boasts that, quote, "At my weakest I am a match for 20, a third of my strength is enough for 30, warriors avoid the battlefield for fear of me, and whole armies flee before me." To which Emer nonchalantly replies, "Not bad for a boy." And this is the idea, right? You are so feared that you're so just and intelligent and superior, because this is the idea, again, that the barbarian could not be. Because the barbarian is stupid, right? He's even more physically strong, right? But he's just like Thor that tricks the giants, etc. It's because they're dumb, right? But it still shows the enormous power that these cultures could have. In fact, the same Emer, interestingly enough, is not like, in the good old radically violent Indo-European Roman tradition, that the next, Sabine to be raped and subjugated. Emer is, as a female character, still archetypizing this kind of idea that there's a feminine power in the chthonic substratum of Irish culture that has some power over masculinity, right? Something that in the Indo-European religion is completely alien from in any traceable form. In fact, Emer wants Cuchulainn to first win say her respect, right? He has to be the worthy one in front of her eyes, right? This concept, of course, existed also in the European culture, but it would have been immediately evident. So that Cuchulainn is still kind of a boy, in fact, and that's what Hammer says. And this female presence is dramatically fascinating, especially in the idea of military training, because this Cuchulainn has to defeat, to crush Scatha, right? The legendary Scottish warrior woman and martial arts teacher that trains Cuchulainn, right? Is a bit the epitome of this. Not quite. There is also the Morrigan, as we will see. But the idea that these Celtic heroes were trained to this older wisdom that somewhat pre-existed their own forces doesn't exist really in the Germanic land. Where in the Germanic land you have figures also like Brunhild, etc. But those are eventually immediately subjugated, immediately proven that the male is immediately superior. Right here, the male has to learn from the woman. Scata teaches special technique to feat with sword and buckler, right, according to the Irish tales. That say that the Scata's island was found either in the east of Alba or in the Isle of Skye, where the local tradition placed the Dunsgate, the Dun Scata, and you know that there were specific centers in Britain where the Druids taught this older set of practices, were a bit the sum of knowledge of Celtic culture that, as also the Romans explained, the Druidic class were the monopoly of an elite that wouldn't share this with the rest of the people, because these people could not afford, were not worthy enough, right? Only the heroes, only the great warriors in this, again, feudal case that ruled, say, in Celtic society, really could afford. And the feats of, there's not just Scata in the mythology, but for example, this pseudo-historical king probably exists, in fact, Domhnall MacAda. There are various references to various teachers, as we will see. Were highly potent practical moves. For example, when Cuchulainn fights Cochar Croibne, one of Scata's warriors and a very hardened man, Cochar tried his special tricks of battle, but Cuchulainn parried them as if he had studied them his whole life, which is probably what these warriors actually did. A bit like the later knights. It's not there was a moment you stopped training or fighting, which was practically also the same thing, because we're all competing with one another within the same war bands, etc. Very often in the war band, part of the deal was that someone was normally taken out, literally, were killed in this kind of ritual fighting. It was kind of a human sacrifice, right, to test also. They knew that somebody had to die. So they would do everything, of course, not to beat them, but it was normal because at that point their life didn't belong to them anymore. And these special tricks were the proof, the confirmation that the divinity lived, had through them, right? They had their power, they were rising, and they could inspire also to leadership, etc. So these tricks, special tricks, are probably advanced techniques of bit of everything, of martial arts, mostly of swordsmanship, as we can guess. The Irish are not particularly famous for the degree of armoredness, because, again, of the aforementioned material poverty. But of course, the elite, these heroes, these kings, would always have the best, most updated equipment, right? You would have not, strangely, seen a high king of Ireland using a full Roman panoply, right, or something, or an hybrid with it, also the Celtic one. The same goes for their horse riding capabilities, albeit, the deal was exactly because they were heavier, they had to go on battlefield with a chariot, dismounting, fighting against the opponent, etc. But this could also be a relatively small engagement, considering what these petty kingdoms were factually about in size and power. In any case, the female presence in military training goes even more far than that. There was a druidess, Bodmal, in Ireland, who trained Finn MacCummail, for example. Buanan, quote, taught the use of arms to the Fianna. The Fianna is actually, Fianna is already the plural of warrior, right, in Gaelic. That's what it means. Like it's like Kingetos in the other continental Celts, and also in Wales, that, as we've seen, was touched by the Irish. Peredur was trained by 9 witches, so-called, who fought in helmets and armor and had the druidic gift of prophecy, which was normally attributed to women, because again, in the Chthonic religion, say they would have had this more deterministic spell over instead the virile one that was more about action and changing things, breaking the destiny, being stronger than that. The Scat, as we've seen, that actually means the shadowy one, was described as a prophetess and sage, right? As we've seen, Cuchulainn had to fight her rival Eifif and several other hags. Also, when Fionn chased Oscar and the Armud to Pictland and was unable to overcome them, he enlisted a hag to practice magic against them. So here's a bit of common Scot and Pictish female druidic military expertise. And this suggests that these women were not merely, skilled martial artists, but they represented the same druidic class. Perhaps this one predating the Indo-European invasions, that, as you know, was a matriarchal culture in the Bronze Age, and in which women had that, relevance, at least in a much less militarized society, because, of course, there is a disadvantage that same culture had, as the same Indo-European virile-dominated and successfully invasion succeeded for, and therefore there is a reminiscence, at least maybe in the Celtic world, in Gaul, in Britain again, where there were, especially in Gaul, these great masses of the pre-existing populations. The more west you go in Europe, and the least Indo-European, in a sense, thing becomes, so that there is even a sort of, let's say, in fact, central deity, or goddess, deity of war, right? Among the Celts, was also known among the Romans as Victoria, by the way, the victorious one. We know that both the Gauls and the Britons invoked her before battle. Well, in the Irish tradition, this would be the Morrigan, who was known as a triplicate, fundamentally, because she was the Morrigan, that means the Great Queen, first of all, which is probably a title of power. There were different queens, properly, you think, even about Boudica in Britain, but many also in the Irish tradition. There was also Nemine, which meant battle frenzy, and Babdcata, that means battle crow. So these are, isn't it the Odinic, the same Vodanic kind of tripartition, right? This had been adopted sometimes for probably a hybrid between this pre-existing kind of female element that survived in this after the Indo-European invasions, and that partly acquired even or kind of radicalized further this kind of militaristic element. And this is essentially specific of the Celtic world in this scale, right? That also in the Germanic mythology there are the Valkyries, etc., but those mean something very different. Those are essentially the double soul of man, right? The dark one, the feminine one, the demonic one, the one of the Furies of the Erinis that is tamed and becoming a Uranic symbol like the Valkyrie in the moment of death of the warrior, the highest sacrifice in battle, when the spirit is hired in the midst of chaos, right? There are Germanic women fighting, but they may have been, if we had to explain it socially and culturally, there were a few, and it's because they belong to the elite. So it's obvious that there would be, normally in the human population, some woman that was more proclivious to this kind of properly military lifestyle. At some point, some lived in their entire life as warriors. Some settled down, they had children. They were perfectly housewife, let's say. And And there is a lot of skepticism about, in fact, legitimately so, about the presence of consistent amount of female warriors, right? In Celtic communities, we find a 10% of female graves containing weapons, but let's say roughly half of them are ornamental, right? There are only some women graves with battle-scarred weapons, and consider that also not all the graves that we find are, of course, representative of the entire deal, because these are aristocratic, again, graves. And we even find Torcs there, so as if they had been part of those, at that point, sisterhoods, right, war bands, like the men, because the Torc is a bit a universal symbol. They had it even, I don't know, among the Parthians of things. It could be just ornaments. It's not that meant that they were actually part of war bands, but there are chariots. I mean, there is this idea that in part they were associated with that kind of warlikeness. And in early Ireland, surely there were several women as members of the Fianna, so belonging to this kind of comitatus. We know of the warrior queens like Macta of the Red Hair, Maeve of Connaught, Credney, the Fainit, and also, as we were mentioning before, Boudica, Cartimandua, etc. Petronius even describes a female Brittonic gladiator who fought from a chariot, right? And in medieval Scottish and Irish literature, there are women involved in warfare, especially as commanders, which suggests still, again, that this function was associated to the elite that was overloaded in responsibility, and even just considering the amount of times, these women would remain widows, and that lineage, let's say, like in feudal Europe, hadn't been properly narrowed down, and it was being part of the clan. It was still patriarchal, but still, not patrilinear, because it was about the clan, not about a single man. They may rose to some level of political and even military responsibility, but it doesn't mean that it was the norm for a woman to be a warrior, right? Just like today, I think the same proportion is true, right? There are much less women in the military than men, and this is kind of an obvious biological reason, especially considering the, how could women rule in a military and agricultural societies? I mean, men are just stronger and more powerful, and they would always have kind of the edge in the first place. But of course, every woman can fight, and can fight like hell, especially if they are so mentally driven, like the men in this kind of properly traumatically obsessive, ambitious, militaristic, sanguinary society, which is what these people do entirely as a purpose of living. So there is really nothing strange about it, after all. And there would be other hints about that. I never made a video on the topic because I think it's, at the end of the day, it's irrelevant. It's just in these cultures here that are relatively peripheral to the broader European system that we find such participation, right? Again, a woman leading an army, yes, you find, I don't know, Matilda of Canossa, you find Isabel of Castile, etc. But they are different contexts, right? Where it's not about the warlikeness of the single woman that is a normal datum of that culture. It's just, they happen to be needed in that position because they were politically important individuals, right? So that's, in my opinion, the same with the Celtic fringe in Britain, except, again, for the reason I said before, that is to say the pre-existing, the pre-Indo-European stratum that has this relevance. And besides this training, of course, that was, let's say, part maybe probably of the early childhood even mentality indoctrination, there was the actual so not necessarily the actual physical training, but don't think that kids were not also properly exposed to violence, if anything, visually or as a value. These kids were just knowing since they were little that what their prerogatives were. They were already fanatic. The entire community and culture was about this. The actual initiatory right, let's say, consistent in participating to an actual feat of arms, usually participating in a raid, which is a light thing, in which also the inexperienced can start participating. Of course, it was properly a hierarchy, so you were always under someone with somebody's kind of like boy squire, the kind of idea, right? But the important thing was coming back with some kind of trophy, right? Hopefully the proof you had killed someone. And in fact, this is a tradition. The Middle Irish fitness of names states, quote, each young man of theirs, is talking about Ulster, who first took arms would enter the province of Connacht on a foray or seek to slay a human being, right? Consider that in 17th century Scotland, this was still going on. So this tells you what these people were properly mentally about, something that today, in 2022, like a person born and raised, even maybe in fact in Scotland, in Ireland, hasn't the palest idea of what it actually means to live, right, from a moral, physical point of view, right? But this was normality up to a couple of centuries ago. Head hunting, as we've seen, was an actual thing, right? It's a myth of those who say, oh no, the Romans wanted to show that the Celts were evil and barbarians, they severed heads, and so it's the evil Roman. The Celts did that, right? And it wasn't just about, saving the hand of, those who had fallen away from home, the friends. It was about the enemies as well. The Celts did it, the Germans did it, the same Romans did it. The Romans totally loved decapitations. They were fond of them. So just learn what Indo-European culture is, and don't stop with this kind of 1930s form of social Darwinism, for which you don't even understand the ABC of the continent, which you're supposed to understand anything from an historical, cultural point of view, which you don't understand absolutely nothing. The first objective of a young Irish warrior would have been naturally to enter the milieu d'entourage of a king, right, of the many that existed, the most powerful ones. And so again, it's always the thing of boyhood. These kids separated from the families early on to go live in this living nightmare of complete hellish initiatory right through the most systemic, traumatic, and irreversible form of psychophysical abuse among this other youth that fiercely competed again at the courts of these kings, and rising through the ranks, hoping for marriages within the same family, etc. But there was an alternative, because given that we said that this was still kind of a feudal culture, and yes, maybe Ireland not being so stratified doesn't look like that, but it actually was, right? And the entire Celtic world was it. Still meant it was kind of a favor owed to maybe not necessarily the firstborn, but somebody that covered a more specific institutional role, right? It was brought at the center of the possession of the property of the clan leadership. The same Ireland with the great king, the High King. So the other youth, and also we can imagine here there wasn't too much of a fact of a social divide by a certain degree, would have another option, that is becoming a mercenary, right, and participating to the brotherhoods of warriors, war bands, the fiannas, right, and the king's clientels work pretty much in a similar fashion. I mean, kings had fiannas on their own. The point is, this is a bit like the Zippe and the Comitatus in the Germanic world. You have a king that has been chosen because he is, again, he has that authority, discipline, rationality, charisma that he has earned through primarily a political but also military training. And he rules the Zippe, so the amount of also the non-properly militarized community, the one of the militia, of the farmers, of the freemen that lived kind of, not literally a peaceful life, but at least not one that was systematically about being abroad and raiding and killing and pillaging and so on. Consider that there were also a lot of serfs because of that aforementioned, if not slaves properly, that aforementioned kind of idea that in theory the freemen wouldn't have to work but just to fight, because that was the only horizon. In fact, there were the servants, popularly known as gillies, that managed the households for their masters, that could augment also, in fact, the lower ranks of the Celtic armies in general and for the local rulers. But what is important here is that there wasn't quite like a categorical difference. Like, every person was considered as different in that degree, again, of degeneration from divine perfection. And so these people happened to be just in the lowest rank. And properly then there were the slaves that were prisoners of war, or people that had screwed up for some reason, or simply being brought under viciously and abusively and oppressively. But that was the world. And functioned like that, and the fact that they could have not maintained their freedom equated to the right of the stronger to rule on them. That's the mentality that the world has at that point. The Fiannas are something relatively different, but severely more savage and brutal beyond any description. I've already been quite graphic and explicit about the Comitatus, so much that I think I will create a playlist dedicated to it. But the Celtic Fiannas are really amazing and very fascinating. So the Fiannas were, as we described it before, war bands of men who roamed around. These were the sexually mature ones. They could not be essentially sustained by the rest of the community. They were unmarried, that were also poor, frankly, and they were seeking for fortune and fame. It's what Polybius would have called like the Gaesatai, right? And that's the Gundestrup cauldron features as a row of birdless, spear-armed youths, right? That because they had managed finally to kill someone. This is something witnessed also among the Germans as well, that you should have some tribes should have not been shaved until they had killed a human being in combat, another warrior. In Wales also they had names as the Contrevs. The medieval Gaels called them Seternak, I believe. And so this is the anglicization of Cairn as well as Cateran in Scotland. And the entire point of the Fianna is that it gravitated around a warrior cult based on a god, but also often chieftain, semi-divine individual that claimed this medium with the divinity, this closeness with it for, again, kind of racial reasons and descent, power, things like this, but also that was forged in the battle. Like, those who received victory were the ones blessed by the divinity, and they could rise to power as well, because the sacredness had been properly highlighted at that point to say that is the one, right? Again, when you entered these brotherhoods, basically you didn't exist anymore. You were given another name. You were viciously abused until your sole purpose was to emulate, in a kind of suicidal fashion, the top warrior of the band. And if you were not up to that, you were considered inferior, and you would have been probably also killed by your own fellow war band men, let's say. And the idea is that we know from Celtic warfare in general what this would mean, right? They would literally live in the wild, which in Ireland was just, I would say, the normality. In many ways, Irish monks condemned the Fiannas as properly sons of death, right? The Fiann having made a bow of evil, right? And they were living diabolo instincto, right? So with a diabolical instinct and kind of possession. It's a bit the same idea of the berserker, the Ulfednar, and this kind of thing. And they were fanatically faithful to their chiefs, because again, being less than them meant to be lost forever into nothingness, because the alternative in this world, which is also what the actual Christian hell means, is that you disappear, right? If you die in combat and you manage to surpass yourself as a human being transcendental, you will transfigure and win heaven and the immortality of the soul. If you don't die like that, your soul will remain essentially of a lesser quality, and it will roam around the world for a while after your death, but the soul will be reabsorbed by the deities of the underworld, that again were the pre-Indo-European cults of the mother, that were instead scared of the same violence of this kind of activity, and so they were associated with cowardice, right, and nothingness, and being brought under this demons of the earth that swallow everything and put everything together into a humus and annihilate your own identity and individuality. So the greater ambition was to die in battle, and we find battle accounts about Celtic warfare, about people keeping to fight, being transpassed with spears, limbs cut, and it's not unrealistic, actually. Of course, this required a great deal of indoctrination. Some people say, it's also they needed some substances to speed up maybe the carelessness and even physical sensitivity to pain, etc. Well, yeah, it's possible, but we underestimate, as always, properly the power of human mind that are terrifying. And in theory, the Fiannas were, for this religious character, like praised in pagan culture, right? They saying the best Fiannas, they all competed with each other. Those were essentially gangs of mobsters killing each other on a regular basis. The best ones would be hired by the High King, who therefore had this kind of professional troopers next to the paramilitary in fact, the militia that derived from kind of the more civilized, peaceful world, and this sanctuary, the centers like Tara, etc., that were kind of more about trade, peaceful exchange, but still dominated factually by these nice errands, right, war bands, that very often were factually just murderers, brigands, right? They supported themselves by hunting in the forest and living there, so much that they were compared to wolves living in the wilderness, right? Call it wolfing, in fact, in the Irish annals. This is, again, just like the Ulfat now. And they literally believed, in a sense, in another dimension. They were too dangerous to be integrated in the community unless they managed to win the community, and therefore gaining that, again, moral capacity to manage the world, while the others were out. And so it was a fierce competition. And the Irish landscape, as you know, at the time, more even than today, was kind of pretty much forested. And there was a specific practice that the Fiannas used, and this tells you how widespread they were properly in the community. That is, leaving some stone-lined cooking sites scattered throughout the wilderness, so that the next band would arrive, would find it, and could cook there, and moving swiftly. And this was a very effective way also later on to, for example, escape the Anglo-Norman armies that were more about heavy cavalry in the open, whereas the Irish always hid kind of in the forest, and they made this hit-and-run tactics for which they couldn't withstand the cavalry charge. And they would disperse in the forest and would find all this kind of essentially logistical system, tracks. This existed also among other peoples, right, among the Germans, etc. And it was their own way of logistics, right? Very limited, very primitive, but still quite effective, especially against enemies that were not used even just properly to live that way. They didn't know the terrain. There was a nightmare, a labyrinth, etc. And a bit, if you look at Celtic art in Ireland, think about properly the various motifs, the Book of Kells, you see this intricacy of symbols that naturally means it's the same symbol of the properly in the other Indo-European mythologies of faith being sown, being in inextricable ways, speaking of the complexity and the of the universe in its entirety. But it does resemble this phytomorphic idea of the force of the world, of this pretty weird thing to sort out, that the way of the warrior would help open it. Right? We were just talking about that for late medieval warfare a couple of days ago. That's basically the same thing. Naturally, these Fiannas were the same guys that we were documented before in the Roman army, in the Auxilia Palatina, like the Cotti. They were basically the same thing. They were pretty good for, their own standard. It compensated dramatically of a technical shortage that the Romans would compensate with, because they armed them with this overwhelming moral force that very often was also quite significant, even against more advanced armies, in spite of all. So this is more or less the picture we can draw. If we were to make a bit more of a political and social section of the Irish military at this point, we would definitely see something more stratified. Like, again, there is this idea that the Celtic Fringe mostly relied on infantry. It was kind of obvious. It was a bit that scarce social stratification, a bit the ground that was difficult. But again, the core of, say, the decisive shock troops were mounted, either on chariotry or properly mounted on horseback. Caesar, that is not talking specifically about the Irish, but the Celts in general, and there wasn't actually any sensible difference among the various Celts in tactical terms, calls these equites, so just like the Roman knights, right? In Wales, this would have been the teulu, that is the family, so there was a very strong clanic bond. This is very important. The parental ties that also explain, as I was saying before, why in this very kind of lineage-based realities, the family was more important than that was the clan entire and the kingdom entire, right? As the only base on which they could keep things together, because they understood that unity in lack of resources was the only thing that really kept things together, right? Had they been a richer system, like in later feudal Europe, Frankish feudalism, it would have become instead about, succession, but a single lineage succession, other children excluded from inheritance, just the firstborn son. Instead, this is typical of kind of more tribal cultures. Such fraternities were famous. They overlap sometimes with the same Fiannas at a point. The Red Branch of Ulster is perhaps the most famous of these fraternities, but other recorded in the Irish annals are the Clanna Morna, the Clanna Bausn, I don't know how to pronounce it, Clanna Diaga, etc. And so, the clan. There were other subdivisions, this perhaps properly more matching with the Fiannas, that were, of course, military shoutouts, like Men of the Lion, Men of the Green Swords, Men of Snow, Knights of the Calf. The Calf is not really, a specific Indo-European symbol, but again, it's the idea that there is this more chthonic, bloody, terrestrial power that is still there, that still produces warriors from this weird land that the Celts have absorbed, but not quite so much, and the mystery of it is kind of, again, work to sort out. In Munster, there were the Knights of the Golden Collar, which unavoidably recalls the Torque, present, again, all over the Indo-European world, as properly the chain that you couldn't get rid of anymore. It was given to you in the warband to say, now you belong to the deity, and when you are within this chain, you can't take off anymore. You receive this power. The gold is the matter of the gods, right? And it's unspoiled, it's sacred, and you within it belong now forever to that system, and you have to behave accordingly. And this is at the origin of all the, again, for example, the Danish ring, because also what's the difference between Celts and Germans by a certain degree. We all come from the Indo-European cauldron, and all these other symbols that you can find everywhere in this universal military culture, and that, however, are explicitated in this case. So I was glad to make this video. I think it's quite interesting, at least in the content, and my delivery may be whatever you think, but looking at these various influences and dynamics is quite useful in my opinion, and I hope we will be talking about Gaelic warfare soon. Again, for today I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.